Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca, the head of community at Common Room, which is the intelligent community growth platform that helps you deepen relationships with your community members and your customers, build better products faster, and show just how impactful your community work is across your organization. It helps you build internal advocacy and generally create better products and experiences together with your community. You can learn more about Common Room at commonroom.io, and you can join our Uncommon community. You can find more about the Uncommon community and resources for community building, plus more than 1,000 other community and DevRel leaders at commonroom.io/uncommon. And Stephen will go ahead and put a link to the Slack in the chat. So before we dive in with our special and honored guest, I want to give a few quick notes of gratitude and attribution. First, my teammates and fellow community builders, Stephen and Zara, will be keeping an eye on the chat. They're waving at the top. They'll be answering and collecting questions along the way and ensuring a safe and respectful space, both within the chat and as they also do in our Uncommon community Slack. So 3 cheers for Stephen and Zara. Thank you too. This stuff never happens without you all. Secondly, the music that you heard while walking in was Feel It All Around by Washed Out. Always want to attribute to the artists. It was added to the collaborative Uncommon Tunage community playlist. There's a link in the chat so you can add the song to that playlist. So you can add the songs that you love to work to. And that one specifically was added by one of our incredible Uncommon community members, Marie Antons at Harness. So thank you to Marie for the Wistful Long Summer Nights musical ad. Super appreciate it. I love that one. All right, so that's a lot from me. One of our core missions as hosts of Common Room's Uncommon community is to empower community leaders with knowledge around community building strategies, best practices, and foster enable connections to other experts to share ideas and outcomes for building better communities. So with that goal as our guide, we're extremely excited to host this live author Q&A with Laís de Oliveira, author of Hacking Communities and longtime community builder and strategist, most recently at On Deck. Hi, Laís. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, super excited that you're here. And I know that a lot of our attendees are as well. Some of them created questions when they registered. So a lot of this is not only inspired by your work and what you wrote in the book, but also by their questions and how they sort of coalesce and dovetail together. But before we dive into the lessons that you share in Hacking Communities, I would love to talk about what inspired you to write the book. And what, maybe it's because you were hearing consistent questions or there was a specific audience you were hoping to reach. And then in general, how did you gather all of the boldness that it takes to put it all together and vulnerably release it as a book?
Well, it started in 2014, actually the first time in my life that I got called a community builder. I was living in Malaysia. I had been there for no longer than 3 months. And I started doing that thing I had been doing for a very long time in my life. And I'm a dropout from college. So I had been so far just sniffing around opportunities where I felt I could have the most impact. I had worked for a nonprofit. I was then working on startup ecosystem development. I felt like myself, I wish I would be an entrepreneur, but I come from a family with no entrepreneurial background. So I went to work for an accelerator in Argentina when I was 24, and then I moved to Malaysia, and I started organizing an event called Startup Grind for the Malaysian startup ecosystem. And I had already been organizing Startup Grind in Buenos Aires before that. By the time the community of Startup Grind had about 20-something chapters all over the world. So I landed in Malaysia, and as I started organizing those meetups that I thought were just basically meetups, I got approached by the Malaysian government officials who were part of their ecosystem development initiative. And they invited me to this lunch and took me down Putrajaya, which is their government city. And they were showing me around everything and took me for this very fancy lunch and were saying how they needed more community builders like me. And if I was willing to help them. And suddenly I was like, I don't know what they're talking about. That sounds very important though. And I'm community building, that's me, that's who I am, that's totally what I've been doing. So I started naming what I do, and I understood the importance of naming it. And then I started bringing together other founders and community builders in Malaysia, and connected with many of those in Southeast Asia who are already recognized as community builders. And through that, I started to understand that we spoke the same language. And I got really impressed by that even though we had never we talked about designing interactions, about engineering serendipity. We talked about the very same terminology. By the way, I don't think any of the terminology I created in my book, it's coined by me. It's something that exists in the community already. So I understood this is a science. And I felt the need to be one of the people naming it, because at the time, no one was doing it. And I started writing an article called Hacking Communities within 6 months of my arrival in Malaysia, to explain the serendipitous encounter I had with my profession and with people. And within 6 months, I was working for the Malaysian government. And I was this random Brazilian who had before been living in Argentina and knew nobody in Malaysia. So through that, I understood the importance of community. I was going to write an article. I kept pushing that article away because I was doing too many things. I founded the company eventually, and etc. And eventually, I felt it was time. And when I sat down to write an article, it became a book, and it was too long. And then I went back working, and it took me a long time to actually publish it. I started writing it in 2018. The idea came in 2014, and I published it in 2020. So I think my inspiration, as I said at some points in the book, was to start a conversation with other community builders, individuals like me. So it's really targeted towards the individual community builder who's doing grassroots community, or a community manager or a founder of a community. That individual soldier, almost like brave person, starting to bring people together around a cause, an idea, or project. And that was me back in Malaysia 2014. And that's who the book is written for. And I think that's what inspired me to build a community through the book, to meet more people who would find value in it.
I would also like to have a meta book about the book, because even the journey and the adventure and the experience behind all of that brought you there is really amazing. So thank you for, I mean, I know that's just a punctuated version of all the things that happened, but yeah, thank you for the background. So to set the stage, let's start with a couple of definitions. You do define this in the book, but I would love for you to be able to define it out loud here. When you say hacking community, what does that mean? And you sort of couple hacking and building, but then you say, like, this is what we mean by hacking communities.
Yeah, I kept hacking, by the way, in the title almost as a joke, because there's a lot of life hacks, and I don't think community can be hacked. So hacking implies basically how to my journey on like navigating community terminology without it existing, without knowing it. It meant like finding ways to scale processes and tricks and frameworks that could be replicable and applied to community. That's the hacking component of it. I was basically reverse engineering every single step I was taking and everything I was learning from my fellow community builders, and trying to put it in a framework that was replicable. So that's about hacking, getting to the source code of something to be able to redo it, to reverse engineer it. But at the same time, in writing the book, I figured out that community can't be hacked. Plus, oftentimes there's a negative connotation to hacking, either because hackers try to break through something in an illegal way oftentimes, or the connotation of life hacks I find negative, because it's basically like trying to take shortcuts for life instead of like going the long run and like following your journey. So the point of like keeping hacking communities was almost a joke, because in a nutshell, when I was writing the book, part 2 is the hacking communities part with all your frameworks and how-tos. And part 1 is filled up with principles, values, and fundamentals, without which I don't think a person can build community. And the irony is that after living in Malaysia and creating kind of my frameworks, I moved into San Francisco. And because of my state of mind at the time, I dealt with loneliness and lots of personal issues. I wasn't able to simply copy and paste my own framework and use my own terminology to simply build community again. And through that journey, I reinforced the understanding that there is no way to just copy and paste community. You need to have something authentic to it. You need to have something genuine to it. you need to be in the right state of mind, which is abundance mind, that we'll talk about it, I'm sure, later. And you can't simply copy and paste and replicate it. And I think that's what makes it challenging and sometimes fluffy for many people. But yes, we can't just do like growth hacks, the community hacks as you do in marketing. And that's the irony. But hacking community basically means, in a nutshell, getting to the source code of community and trying to make it replicable, or aligning terminology, bringing community to an understanding of like making it a science.
Yeah, I think something about this idea of, genuineness, sincerity, authenticity leads into the next definition I'll have you talk about, and then we'll dive into the book. So in chapter 4 on page 52, and in case anyone has their book open, you describe key differences between communities built on belonging versus fitting in to the cool club, right?
Yeah.
And so one is love-driven or abundance-driven, I think you might say as well. I got to see you at a panel at Clicks earlier this year, and I really enjoyed how it really resonated with me, your abundance-driven approach, which are communities that are built on a feeling of belonging. And then the other type of community or anti-community maybe, or like, goal, whatever you might call it, coalition of people, collection of people, is a fear-driven approach, which is built on the desire to fit in and to not fall out of fitting in. So can you talk about how or why that distinction matters to the rest of today's discussion about building community, one based on love or abundance or authenticity, and the other based on this fear of not fitting in?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect question, because I think the distinction matters. Also, when I started writing the book, I figured that many people could try to take in what was like the community hacks and try to build in something for them to own and control. And community, by definition, is collectively owned. And I'll start by saying that why we see an emergence of community now, coincidentally with the emergence of Web3, it's not actually a coincidence, because Web3 is inherently about shared ownership and user-owned content. But anyways, back to the difference I established back then when Web3 was not really on my mind. What I call the cool kids club is usually micromanaged, usually does not scale really well, is authoritarian, and it's based on features one can't control. It's very prone to discrimination. It's something where you gotta have money to enter this club. If you look at the definition of a club, I personally don't like that term. And whenever a friend of mine is building a community, except for book clubs, for me are the exception, and I can get into it in a minute. But in general, the idea of a club implies that you need to own something or be something. They're generally places where people have to act according to a certain way. But the thing is that people have to act in a certain way in communities too. But I think that in communities, the motivations are more intrinsic and more related to values and merit. Whereas in a club, it's more related to your predefined labels and what you own and your appearances. And in a nutshell, I think that the distinction matters because communities can scale on a grassroots way. They can grow exponentially and organically without a rigid infrastructure. Thus, they are more efficient because when delegate to everybody the power to belong, and you are able to grow, for example, with self-moderation. You are able to get people within your community who are acting accordingly to your community principles, delegate to them the power. You can have self-ownership, self-moderation, and that leads to scalability. Versus a cool kids club, you're always going to need an auditor, a manager, a micromanager. And in my opinion, that's way less scalable. So the distinction matters because the infrastructure of both differs. In one, you need decentralized management. In the other, you need distributed and community-owned moderation and membership. That is the advantage of community, economically speaking. And I'm putting it in economic terms to make the difference because I feel that Cool Kids Club not only exclude people in a way that don't allow people to belong if they wanted to, they are not efficient. Communities, because people who otherwise wouldn't have met and felt like they belonged, connect at a deeper level are more sustainable in the long run. They can be more merit driven. People can act according to principles in order to grow in the ranks, climb the ladder, versus like, oh, if you're not part of X family, you can't belong here. If you don't have X amount of earnings, you can't belong here. That's a cool kids club. So again, the core difference, the importance of establishing the difference is efficiency and sustainability. I believe communities as a model are more sustainable, and you can build a cool kids club. What you gotta know is that you're always gonna need a micromanager. And I don't like that idea, organizationally speaking, in terms of organizational structure. And that's at the core why this definition matters. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, I will definitely let people chime in the chat too, and we're going to save space at the end. So to have their questions and deliver them directly to you as well. But to me, it does make sense. And I think especially when you're talking about scalability and sustainability, one of the things that you talk about in your book, right, is that you're like, one of your biggest roles and one of your biggest jobs is to scale yourself as a connector. And you're all about like allowing, you're not going to be able to do everything, and you're not supposed to do everything in a community. It's like people take different roles, responsibilities, you're able to connect others, and then they're able to deepen their connections and then give back in a different volume than what one person can do if they're just trying to micromanage, let's say, a club. So should we dive in?
Yeah.
You ready?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for like setting that stage for us. For the rest of the talk about the book, we will focus most of our talk on a few key chapters. So chapter 14, the idea about bringing people together. Chapter 11, which is the stages of the community life cycle. Chapter 16 about engineering serendipity. I love that. And then chapter 17 about understanding and building closeness circles.
Perfect.
So to kick off our discussion, I wanted to start inspired by a question submitted by a community member. So Paul at Zindi had asked, what are the best ways to encourage real community engagement beyond having someone sign up? And so I think his question dovetails really nicely with a lot of what you cover in chapter 14 about bringing people together. So on page 179, for anyone following along, you cover 5 key points. You talk about designing good excuses to bring people together. The second one is respecting the 3 C's of connectedness. So it's consistency, cadence, cohesion. The third is building relationships through content design. The fourth is engineering serendipity. And then the fifth is building closeness and empowering people within your community. And then you also talk about meals, capital MEAL, little s. So it's like miscellaneous ways, ways of bringing people together through entertainment, through action, or through location. So I know that's a large way to couch this question, but if back to Paul's question around, how do you encourage real engagement beyond just signing up? I'm wondering if there's a few examples to these like, 5 points, key points to bring people together, and then how he might put meal into action.
Well, that is a long question. That's basically why I wrote a book. But I think that one realization that has grown in me and that keeps growing is that you really gotta have a very sharp, clear understanding of why you're building your community. And oftentimes we are in love with our product and we want to build community around them, but we don't even know why. And the people who we are building community for oftentimes already belong to other communities. And why would they have to spend more time contributing to yours? So first and foremost, I think that when I talk about engagement, my key question to you is, what does contribution mean to you? What is the action that you want them to take if you were to define engagement? Because if you were like, oh, I just want people to, participate every day, log in every day, like why? Why would they do that? And by doing that, what do they gain? And how does contribution create collective value within your context? I also like to give the example of a sales CRM, where if any mentee of mine is here, they are just close their ears because you heard me saying this like 500 times. But when I ask people, what is the value proposition of a sales CRM, like Pipedrive and Salesforce? And people go like, oh, they allow you to organize and track your leads. Oh, they allow you to do more efficient follow-ups and etc. But then I go into like, okay, so what happens when people do that? What happens when they keep track of their leads and prospects? In a nutshell, they sell more. And by selling more, they make more money. So the value proposition of Salesforce, of a sales CRM in general, is sell more efficiently, make more money in a nutshell. And there are more ways in which you can help people sell more beyond tracking your leads. That's where community comes in the case of a SaaS platform, sales CRM style. How else can I help my people make more money, optimize their sales, optimize their leads, voice tone, sales speech, body language? How can I become a better salesperson? That's where community enters should deliver value to me, a customer, aligned with the same reason why I downloaded, signed up, or subscribed for your business to start with. I came here to sell more, make more money. Help me do that in every way you can. And there's ways in which only community could help me beyond product. So I'm giving you an example that's very specific to a SaaS platform. But in a nutshell, first I need to know, what is your core value proposition? And how can your people around you actively take a certain action that is simple enough and that will directly contribute to creating value in alignment with your value proposition? Once you figure that out and you know what you want them to do, I think the first step is that you really let them know that you want them to do that. But then let's get together to just talk about what I wrote in the book as meals, the 3 C's, building relationships, engineering serendipity, and building closeness. They're all for me just kind of like one thing in different steps. So first, I think that the core of community is that you want people to take action by creating value to each other. For example, in the case of a sales CRM, you might create a space for people to interact, to share. This is my puppy, by the way. To share. Hey, Pina. To share sales advice with each other. So you want people to you want to create a culture where your customers would start sharing ideas or best practices on how to have a better sales pitch. And you can do that through, so in a nutshell, your purpose here is to increase interactions. You can do this through a series of excuses, meals, that over time build a culture of collaboration. So your only goal is to really create a culture, create a set of behaviors that eventually happen without you, that you are eventually obsolete. So say you create a series of events, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the 3 C's and the frequency, cadence, and catalyst effects that I think we're also going to dive deeper in later. But your goal is to educate people that by sharing knowledge with each other, they learn more, they gain more in line with what their purpose is in their company, in which by sharing knowledge about how to become a better salesperson, I learn from others too. And over time, I become a better salesperson. So to educate, quote unquote, your customers, you want to maybe start by making them contribute in a very easy way. So I like to give an example of a meal is just what my friend Hugh Mason calls a turkey, in which he describes community as community building is like the turkey in the Thanksgiving table. People get together to eat the turkey, but what really matters are the conversations around the table. But I'm vegetarian, so I didn't want to put a turkey in my book. So I created the acronym MEAL. Because I also think the meals are always a great excuse to gather people. So you want to create meals that are aligned directly to your core value prop. So you want to create, for example, an event that happens monthly where people share best practices. You want to create a quarterly sales speech competition. You want to create an annual conference where your customers get together to share how they are using your tool and report sales outcomes. So I'm giving examples here of how, and I'm giving examples of a specific product that I can't mention because it's very specific to them, but it's a sales CRM that I work with in community strategy. And basically, they turned their community from a support community, which is the most basic type of communities companies often start, into a community that helps people achieve that value proposition, which is sell more. So you want to make sure that you create a cadence of events, and that's one of the 3 C's, because people follow rhythms. Cadence is what makes it happen organically, is what makes it over time happen without you being there. consistency is what makes people feel like they can trust you. Over time, you'll never come to them to sell something else with those events. Those events are meant to only add value to them. So consistency builds trust, and coherence, it's about there is an alignment between your cadence and your consistency. Over time, everything is cohesive. The wording using your website, your voice tone, it's always going to be the same. And you are able to transpire that through your community managers, through your team. So everybody's speaking the same language. In a nutshell, the importance of having these excuses, the meals, the 3 C's, cadence, consistency, coherence. And I can talk more about building engineering serendipity, building relationships and closing the circles. They're very similar. I can talk about that in a minute, maybe the next question, so that I don't take too long here. But the purpose of everything is that you really design interactions that build trust. And those interactions need to be the area in which your people engage, they take action for their own good, because they know they're going to gain something. And the goal of organizing events and keeping them predictable, keeping them in a rhythm, and keeping them aligned to your value proposition is to build trust, to make sure that people keep coming back. In a nutshell, what you want is that people come to your events, learn that they can make friends with someone else. And after the 5th time they come back, they see familiar faces. They feel like they're not a stranger there. Over time, that's what builds community. Over time, your regulars will become your event organizers, your top contributors. And that's what closer circles eventually will mean. So your goal is to consistently provide value and create a culture of contribution that over time people can enact without you. I'm not sure I went a long way there, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I love it. And I think you sort of read my mind about, because there are 5 points that you talk about, bringing people together. And then one of the points is around engineering serendipity, which essentially is what the next question is about. So another way to increase engagement that you've talked about is by scaling your own role as a connector, which I think I referenced a little earlier. And so in chapter 16 on page 201, you cover engineering serendipity to increase community connections. And you talk about the goal not being about controlling the connections, but by increasing the rate of encounters that might engender those connections, right? So how many times you bring people together, at what rhythm, at what cadence, with what consistency, so that they can build trust and start to understand how they get involved. They feel familiar, they feel like they belong, and they get to see people that they built relationships with that they wanted to see again. So you cover 3 key elements, right, about engineering serendipity: the frequency, the density, so how you design spaces that are conducive to conversations, and then the catalyst, so anything that can accelerate those connections. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, maybe you take that same example you were talking about in terms of that, sales CRM or something else that you like, about best practices you've seen across various communities at different sizes and stages, for, finding the right frequency, or what that catalyst was that really helped that community get to that next step in terms of like increasing those connections and creating the space for that to happen.
By the way, I love how specific you are in reading like the page and look from the book, like very good, like well done in the homework. So this is actually my favorite topic, and I think this is actually where I think the magic of community is. And technically serendipity is hard to be engineered, which is why I think the framework is inspired by chemistry. I think we all learned in high school about the particle theory, or collision theory, which is basically the rate of successful reactions is proportional to the rate of collisions. The more collisions, the more likely there will be successful reactions. I don't know if you all as a kid went through the experience of having your mom really wanting you to be friends with some other kid and like, hey, you should be friends. And generally those were not the kids you became friends with. You became friends with the ones that you went to school with and you saw the most and you interacted with. And maybe we didn't even like each other, but then you saw each other enough and played in the same team, eventually got to know each other and figure out that, hey, this person's not that bad. And you're still friends. At least I have a lot of examples like that in my personal life. And I've seen this across the board with all my friends and close ones. So we naturally tend to become closer with the people we interact with the most. So your job as a community builder is not to try to introduce everyone, because A, that's not going to scale, and B, that makes you a control freak, is to enable a platform for people to interact. And that can either mean that you want to host events frequently and get out of the way. I'm going to talk about frequency, density, and catalysts in a minute. But again, that could be the same as like I'm creating a series of events that happen over time and that always happens. Or that could mean that I'm developing a platform like a software where people can find each other without me, like a directory or forum where there are discussions. In a nutshell, and back to the idea of meals, every single post, every single article, every single event is what I consider a meal, is an excuse, the point of encounter. They serve as a water cooler effect that people bump into each other enough on the water cooler. They work in different departments of your company, but thanks to that water cooler, different areas, marketing and sales and engineering might start a conversation that is diverse because they bump into each other thanks to that coffee, to that excuse, that water cooler. So the idea of diversity is inherent to the idea of engineering serendipity. The goal of engineering serendipity is to enable connections that otherwise would not happen and allow people to recurrently see each other's faces over time, so recurrently that they might forget the differences and learn they have more in common than they thought. So it's really about making conversations. So now, to how you do that, I will resort back to particle theory, where particles that collide more often will have more successful reactions. Again, not every collision might lead to successful reaction, meaning not every conversation will lead to a collaboration, to a friendship, to value creation. But the more often, the more likely. You can enhance that through frequency. That's cadence. Same thing as cadence. Like people follow rhythms. They like when something is recurring. How to choose the right frequency? There's a lot of factors to define that. But first, you might have different types of events, of excuses, and some of which might require people to come in daily. Some might bring people on the last Thursday of every month together. What matters is that there is some sort of predictability in terms of how often people meet, that frequency that might enhance the likability of collisions. Density, basically, it's like just don't host a party for 10 people in a football stadium. And creating coziness, I think the key word is coziness. Coziness itself is a catalyst. When you meet someone in a physical space and it feels like your house living room, there's a couch, there's a fireplace, dim yellow lights, that instinctively makes you feel more comfortable than if you met someone on something that feels like a dentist office, like bright blue lights and weird, uncomfortable chairs. So creating coziness to create the feeling of proximity and comfort that accelerates the likability of trusting each other. So it's really about creating cozy spaces online. That can mean having a meeting for only 10 people at a time, instead of trying to host webinars for 100 people every time. And catalysts can be multiple things, and it really depends on your business. I usually like to talk this case by case of people, but I'm going to give a couple of examples. Hopefully one will hit it off. Catalyst could be the fact that I went to my friend's place and she invited this stranger to hang out with us. Just happens that the stranger was her friend from childhood. Within 1 hour, I found myself sharing deep stuff about my life with that stranger. My friend was a catalyst. I borrowed trust in her friend through her. So connections can be a catalyst. Wine can be a catalyst. Density, as I said, it's a big catalyst in my opinion. Or an activity, prompt, giving people something to talk about. So basically what you want with a catalyst is accelerate the rate in which people go from stranger to friend. I love this quote that is reportedly from William Butler Yeats, just that it's not. I've already validated that he never said that, but it's a good quote that says, "There's no strangers here, only friends you haven't yet met." So the idea of catalysts is anything that accelerates trust. I'm going to give another silly example, but brand is a big catalyst. The fact that you jump on Airbnb and are able to sleep on a stranger's house, that platform serves as a catalyst to trust. And I'll stop there. But I think in a nutshell, engineering serendipity, it's about enhancing the likability of successful connections that allow people to share value with each other in whichever ways you want them to exchange value within your community. And it's about designing interactions that are continuous frequency, that are cozy, that have density, and accelerate trust, allowing people to really build relationships. And over time, that's your ultimate goal, to build long-lasting relationships through your community.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that though the things that worked at, a scale of 10 and then 50 and then 100 and then 1,000 might be different across the stages of your community. And one of the big things is that you've built trust with your community and a two-way dialogue where it's like, hey, what worked then, does it still work now? And let's have like real conversations about the frequency, right? Or about the cadence, or should we do this more often or break these into smaller groups now that we've gotten quite big? Or I think there are probably a lot of ways that in dialogue with your community, it changes across stages.
Yeah. And there's so much we could go so much deeper in each of these things, but I think two things that are worth mentioning is that diversifying the profile of events is important to enhance this likability of successful connections. And it also relates to closeness circles. For example, at Startup Grind, when I was living in Malaysia, I was hosting monthly meetups that for me were not a flagship, actually, that would be something else, but they were like a lighthouse event. A lighthouse event serves to attract lost souls in your community that might care about the same thing. So a lighthouse event is basically something that welcomes everybody and talks about the topic that is core to your community. So for instance, I hosted monthly meetups in Malaysia for Startup Grind, attracting aspiring entrepreneurs, early stage founders to learn from a seasoned founder in a mass mentoring session. Through that, I attracted a very wild, very different profiles of founders. Among them, sometimes I would find a Series A founder who was doing really well with their company. And over time, I would meet more people, and there would be a VC coming to Malaysia and asking me to connect them with founders of their portfolio. Eventually, I had built enough connections, and I was able to curate more specific and more relevant encounters that were smaller for different types of people. So I started quarterly serendipity dinners where I would connect a specific group of curated founders, maximum 15 people, including the VC traveling from overseas, to connect Malaysian founders to overseas investors, which was a big problem in Malaysia. That's why I did that. I would also have specific meetups and groups for women. So basically, I started diversifying the type of events that I had to serve more specific crowds. So the more you get to know your people, the more you start to create smaller spaces that are more relevant. And that's also how you scale community. Over time, what also happened is that people from within my community were able to self-organize and spin off and create their own meetups and events, which is also for me an indicator of health of community when your own community members start self-organizing. But basically, as a framework, I like to think of meals in a specific way in which I need to have a flagship event, like a music festival. I want to have parties like meetups or workshops that are usually for like 50 to 100 people. Music festivals for 1,000 people. And then I would have dinners that are cozier for like 8 to 15 people. And I have coffee chats. And you must think about all this. The more outside of your community, the more people might go to a music festival. The more inside, they might go to a VIP party. The more inside, they might go to a private dinner. And the more inside, they might go to coffee chats with each other. Of course, it's not that mathematical, but you want to think about the design of your spaces and the coziness levels accordingly to how close they are to you. The closer they are, the more intimate you want the conversation to be, the more intimate the space needs to be. And I think that's really relevant to build relationships at scale.
I like the mathematical nature of your I like the intersection of science and math. And then like you said, it's like hacking communities, you can't just hack it, but there are rhythms and consistent patterns that people follow, and like to be able to tap into those is super important. So before we go any further, I totally forgot to give gratitude at the beginning, to Samantha and the Socially Constructed online book club that also concurrently read your book, and many of whom are here as well, or they're simulcasting this book club. So thank you to Samantha for bringing your book club to also reading Laís's book and Hacking Communities. And with that said, we do want to leave at least like 10 minutes for live Q&A with you. So if you have questions, Stephen and Zara are collecting those, and then in about 10 minutes, they'll pass them over to me and I will start to ask your questions. So before I ask Laís this next question, wanted to put that out there in case you have questions on your mind that you wanted to get out, that you want Laís to cover. Okay, so back to our regular scheduled programming. Let's talk a little bit about the community development stages and how all these things are interrelated, right? And closeness circles are interrelated. And as your community moves through stages, you're going to get more people that are closer and more that were on the broad audience and broad networks that sort of get closer together or get closer to that core circle. I mean, it's like, time and exposure and coziness and fostering those connections. But in chapter 11, you cover the community development lifecycle. And on page 146, love those page numbers, you use this great metaphor about a dandelion and how it relates to different stages of community development. So you talk about there's seed, there's sprout, there's bud, there's flower, there's seed head, and then there's flying. And you associate each of those dandelion stages with community stages. And then you pair those stages, for example, like the seed stage, with actions that a community builder can take at that stage itself. And so you have this cool little diagram table. Highly recommend 146. Can you tell us a little bit about, what each of those stages briefly is, but then what's one action that you recommend someone taking when their community's at that stage, moving through that dandelion growth?
So I literally have that diagram open, and I actually would just read out loud what I had here, but I try to be more specific into that because I think it's by the way, frameworks and metaphors for me only help us communicate things. I'm not literally telling that you guys should be doing exactly that, but I think it helps us put each other in the same framework. So if you think about a seed, this is the part of me which sometimes gets bothered by how much people think this is fluffy. And I know this is the single most important thing in any company that grows, is that you define why you exist, your core, your belief, and values and mindset. So I put that coincides with the first steps of branding. And that matters because that is actually what long-term will allow you to speak the same language and one single language and attract people who resonate with you. So the first step is to know who you are, what are you here for? The example I have is that when I moved to Malaysia, before all that serendipity happened to me and all those encounters of Malaysian government officials and startup grind, personally, I was working in youth leadership development and economic development. I am passionate about that. That's beyond community why I'm here. And I like the idea of creating jobs and fostering entrepreneurship. And I would just naturally talk a lot about it. One thing that I also say at the point in the book, during part 1, is that authenticity leads to efficiency. The more authentic you are, the less you have to pretend being somebody else. And the more you'll naturally lean into sharing things that resonate with your people. That leads you to a second stage, sprouting. So you start coming out, right? Showing your fresh lime green leaves and showing your colors to the world. Yeah. And that means that you should start talking a lot about what you're passionate about. And I think, again, that happens naturally when your brand is aligned to your core. And at the time, I naturally would just talk about entrepreneurship development every day to the point of boring my friends. Whenever I would go to a different country, picture that I was 25, living in Southeast Asia, and I lived in Malaysia, and I would go to Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, and I would come back, and my girlfriends would be like, "Oh, so what did you do? Did you go to X, Y, and Z place?" And I would be seriously like, "No, I just went to visit the ecosystem." And they were to the point of getting to the point of making me a T-shirt called The Ecosystem, because that's just the only thing that was in my mind naturally at the time. So that sincerity leads you to having conversations, and you start talking about that thing that you care about all the time. As a brand, that means you're obsessed with the problem you want to solve. You're obsessed with making your customers happy. You're talking about them all the time. You're thinking on their behalf all the time. And that leads to budding. And budding is a stage that I think really meshes with flowering, some buds are together with flowers at the same time, that's when you start to attract your first groups of people. Like when Startup Grind started back in 2010, I remember Derek Anderson, the founder, saying that they had encountered meetups with 5 people, 10 people. For reference, today they have 600 chapters all over the world. Each has monthly events serving 50 to 100 people on a monthly basis each. So at the time, it was one event, and this budding groups of people, eventually it flowered into organizers. So budding is when you start attracting people, designing interactions, small groups that grow, and then you start to understand who are your top contributors, and you start to become a more complex community where you have layers of people who attend, people who are regulars, people who are top contributors, people who become organizers, and over time they are able to become seed heads. These people will be able to flower into a seed head and fly to the other side of the ocean and start your community on your behalf, and you can trust them to restart the whole process from seed to sprout to bud to flower, and they themselves will spin off into various communities. So if you think about exponential growth, and if you think of plants, it's really how they grow from 1 to 1,000 to each of these would go to another 1,000. And that's how over time communities that are successful grow exponentially, if that's of course their goal. Not every community wants to grow into 1 million people with a very complex organizational system. Some communities want to be very cozy to like 100 mothers, and that's okay as well. But in any ways, the idea is that you start from a core idea and a small group of people who really share that DNA. And through that, you're able to expand by embedding your core or basically resonating with other people who already share that core. If that doesn't sound like too fluffy of a metaphor, I really hope you guys can understand how to apply that in real life. I can give more examples of how that translated into reality, like in San Francisco or Stockholm and other startup ecosystems, which are my favorite case of study, because startup ecosystems are organic. There isn't usually like the startup ecosystem manager. I also like surfers community and snowboarding communities and bouldering communities because they are 100% self-managed. And that's, I think, a good thing to aim at as a company, to think about how can you grow your startup community as if they were a bouldering community. They have that silent etiquette where they follow rules and principles because it benefits them, not because someone is micromanaging and breathing on their neck for them to engage. And so that's it. I hope I explained the life cycle as you wished.
Yeah, I mean, you've done everything as I have wished. Sounds kind of funny to say, but it's been more, beyond what I could wish for.
Wonderful.
So you're talking about communities expanding exponentially, and I do want to. Samantha from Socially Constructed Online has been posting a bunch of great questions, and I think that this idea of not every community wants to expand exponentially, but in Web3, that is something that is happening with communities really quickly at a scale, a volume, and a pace that is quite different than what we've necessarily seen in the past. And so I wanted to make sure to get to this question, especially because I know that you've done thinking around Web3 communities. So Samantha had asked, there's been a lot of discussion about community in Web3 changing to become more about technology and less about peer-to-peer, which has been a huge criticism that the Web3 movement doesn't exist in that it's just crypto hype, which is one of the criticisms of it. And so Samantha asks, what is your opinion on how Web3 is progressing? It sounds like it might be more of a club in your view. So how do you view it? And maybe how do you think it might transform depending on what your view of it is today versus tomorrow and in the future?
Yeah, so there's definitely a sense of a club in many areas of Web3 because people who got there first and acquired certain tokens first technically have more power, or who joined certain organizations first. But I feel that it's still a very young and ever expanding universe that has open space for others to come and still contribute and gain territory. And many established universes or communities that we thought would really grow within Web3 have been actually losing ground, and others who were small are disrupting. So I think that there is, I see where you're saying there is a sense of cool kids clubs in terms that it's not super accessible to everyone. It's still, in most of the cases, it still relates to your financial power, and that makes it exclusive in a way that I think is a club. But at the same time, technically speaking, also there are ways for you to participate in and gain that are not just by having financial power. And many people can still break into it and break through. The main reason why I would be excited myself about Web3 communities is that I have seen faces that I had never heard of talking about Web3 communities and growing into it right now. And I like the idea that it is opening space for new faces to become experts. And those faces were quote unquote no one. That's a bad thing to say, and I'm kind of like intentionally saying it this way. But in the eyes of society, they were just like gamers 3 years ago, 2 years ago. And now they are knowledgeable in building community within a complex technology platform that no one really understands and that but them. And I think that's super valuable. So first, I want to be respectful to the fact there's a ton of opportunities and a growing metaverse where many people can still gain ground. And in fact, many people have been gaining ground in that. And I see where you're saying it could be a club, but I also feel there's a lot of opportunities for everyone there. At the same time, from the little I know, and I think that I don't know more than I know, honestly, within Web3, even though I have been studying quite a bit about it. And when I was studying DAOs, and by studying, I mean, we started a DAO within the On Deck Community Builders Fellowship last year, with the purpose to help people learn more about community. And if you're not familiar with DAOs, they're decentralized autonomous organizations. And there is this concept within a DAO, which is the concept of a bounty. And in principle, it's a great idea. So here's how it works. Everyone has a shared bank account, and you all got stuff that needs to be done. So the stuff to be done could be tasks, are called bounties. You all vote in the value of each bounty. And if someone performs a task that is highly wanted, they gain proportionally to that value you all agreed upon. And since it's like free market regulated, it's really cool that, for example, I'm going to use this example from our partner at the module we created for Web3. If you're building a co-working space as a DAO, a co-living space more specifically, and there is a bounty, a task that is do the dishes, and nobody wants to do the dishes. And if the price for the task is 50, because no one wants to do that, it's in high demand, let's say, the price for that technically would grow if it's regulated by a computer program and you guys all share that wallet, you all agree on the value of that bounty. And basically it's self-market regulated. So that could be the perfect quote unquote market if you believe in that. The problem is that in practice, when I started diving into DAOs, most of the DAOs that I have been connected to, they are led by a small group of people who highly influence votes, without whom the DAO would not exist. The voting systems are still archaic in a way that people still have to vote about how much value is delegated to each of these things, and they still have to come together to vote. And there's still a problem that not everybody shows up to vote, and that at the end of the day, voting is extremely influenced by that core group of founders or influential people or the most active in the community. In a nutshell, it's still pretty much a community, old school. It's not really decentralized. So if there was a promise of like technology allowing it to be fully decentralized, I don't know if that's good news or not. To be honest, I don't have even a formed opinion, but it's just not decentralized. You still need your top contributors. You still need your most active people. And more often than not, the most active ones are the ones who benefit the most. So in that sense, it's not quite a cool kids club. It's merit driven. The ones who contribute the most would gain the most. And I'm excited about the idea of Web3 from the perspective that it's community-owned, user-owned content. And I hope to see a future where it improves the way we distribute wealth. But that's maybe me being excited about it and theoretical rather than practical, to be honest. But that's how I see a potential Web3 in allowing user-generated, user-owned content, and more than like Web2 allowed user-generated content. Web3 would allow user-owned data. Your data will be owned by you, and that's exciting. And yes, I definitely feel that we have a long way to go to actually build something meaningful and relevant, because so far what we have is just the same community we had with a layer of a bank account that they share.
Yeah, I would also, it's certainly just the beginning. And for me, I'm certainly still in the beginning stages of my understanding. Thank you for diving into that answer. I wanted to make sure too, there's one question as well that Samantha had asked, and someone else was like, ooh, great question. So Samantha loved the idea of coziness. And she had asked, how would you recommend defining and measuring coziness in real life? Yeah.
So that relates to a thing that I have been trying to name, and I actually have been working with one of my mentees to see if she names it, because I also feel like I wrote a book because I wanted to start naming things, but I don't want to be naming things. I want people to start like proposing things that we all share. And one of the things that we all share that is not named yet is what I've been calling temporarily familiarity rate. We could also call it maybe coziness rate, which is over time, how often people see a familiar face in the room. And I think that everybody knows this feeling when you're building a community, and after your third meetup, you see two of your regulars talking to each other without you having done anything. And that happened a lot at Startup Grind when I hosted physical events in Malaysia. After the fifth time, there was a group of regulars who already knew each other, and they made the event feel familiar because they looked across the room and saw familiar faces that instinctively creates a sense of familiarity and trust in the space and in the event. So I think that like a way to measure coziness could be number of returning and recurring or a number of regulars. But beyond that, the number of connections generated amongst your regulars. I know that's very hard to measure, but I think that's one indicator of coziness, which is that sense of it's a small space, it's a village, like it's a small world. I don't know what you think about that. I can make up other metrics right now, but that's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah, let's see. Samantha had said coziness rate equals how often people. Oh, okay. This says capturing your answer. Okay, last question,
Yes,
which is a bit of a. I don't want to call it a softball, but it's a very. I think it's a very probably has a very like clear answer to it. Is one of Socially Constructed Online's members was asking if or when there will be an audio version of the book, and where they can find if they could find physical copies rather than just the Kindle copy online.
I appreciate that. I have been telling people I was going to print it like for a year now, and I plan to. So the short answer is yes for the printed version. I'm definitely curious about audio version because I'm definitely an Audible client, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm not promoting Audible right now, but I love audiobooks. And I am afraid I would have someone narrating it because of my Brazilian accent might be weird for some of my listeners.
You would be authentic and sincere.
Yeah, that's what most people say. I would love your opinion there. Get some community, do a community survey. But the answer is yes. I have been planning to do this. Even the reason why I took a step back from my previous job is because I wanted to focus back into hacking communities, and I wanted to translate it to Portuguese and Spanish too. So I have big plans for it. Hopefully this year still I'm going to be printing it. And I have a challenge, practical challenge of distribution management. I self-published the book, but if I'm printing it, I would have to basically deal with myself, but distribution. And you can imagine how that would work. And I don't want to deal with that, to be honest. So maybe, so the short answer is yes. And I'm stuck with the practical aspects of it. And maybe I'll just try to find a publisher to do that for me. So I'm trying to figure that out. If you have any advice, if you work with a publisher, let me know.
You and I, girl, we should connect offline. I self-published a book, and I also do the distribution. And I basically have a closet full of books where you're like, well, I'm going to be carrying around these with me for a very long time until I'm able to sell them all. And there's just like a space in the closet that's like, that's the book wall.
Yeah, I could do that. We should totally exchange cards on this. And I have been keeping it very, so as I shared, the purpose of hacking communities was to share it with people with whom I'd like to have a conversation. To be very frank, I have been keeping marketing very low key. And I almost let people find my book like they find Fight Club. So, I don't talk much about it. I plan to change that a little bit, but I appreciate your question. So get in touch if you need anything. I can figure out how to give you a physical copy. But yes, I plan to do that eventually this year.
Well, hopefully this discussion will also bring more people into the Fight Club way of discovering your book and all the amazing work and research that went into it. For everyone that was listening or who wasn't able to attend but who registered, we'll be posting this video and a condensed transcript of our conversation to our blog on the Uncommon blog in the next couple of weeks once we get all of that together. And also on Common Room's YouTube channel, which Stephen will put a link to the chat, where we have our other Uncommon book clubs with authors like Carrie Melissa Jones and Richard Millington. And then you can also find Laís on Twitter at Isolive or Isolive. Isolive is how I say it in my mind. And in the Uncommon Slack, which we have another link in the chat there. You can also sign up to get the monthly community newsletter, where we'll highlight this as well. So our Uncommon community newsletter we send once a month at the end of the month. And so you can sign up to get that at commonroom.io/uncommon. You also get music recommendations and a little balloon dog surprise at the end of the newsletter. So hopefully you think that's fun. Thank you again to everyone who attended, to everyone who registered and asked questions, even if you couldn't be here. Especially thank you to our chat moderators, Stephen and Zar, for making all this happen in the background. And Laís, thank you so much to you for your time, for your research, for your thoughtfulness, for your candor, your sincerity. Anywhere else that will you tell us a little bit about your book's website, where people can find out more about you, and then we'll give a big adieu.
Thank you. I think it's just I'm adding my LinkedIn in the chat. I think that's the best way to actually connect with me. I've been a little bit averse to social media for the past month. I need to let you all know, but I'll be back. And it's been extremely fun to speak with all of you. Let's stay in touch. And thank you so much, Rebecca and Common Room team, for inviting me. And very, very good questions. I appreciate all the thought and time you put into it.
Oh, it was totally all joy on our end. So thank you again, and can't wait to highlight.
Samantha, I'll join your Discord. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I just need to say thank you.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead. Connect.
Yes.
Well, have a great rest of your day, and I know that you are 3 hours ahead, so I hope you have a great evening ahead of you in New York.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you all. Have a good day.
All.
Bye-bye.